miles of terror tunnels, an underground network bigger than the New York subway system, which they used to wreak havoc above and below ground. A year later, the IDF has killed or captured more than half of these terrorists, destroyed over 90% of their rocket arsenal.
No prizes for guessing who that was.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Exactly. What he's saying is so familiar, but we're going to pay special attention to where he's saying this.
The United Nations, right?
Yes, the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations, which is supposed to be a global peace broker. This week, Those Books is paying close attention this week to the United Nations. Welcome to all our listeners. I'm Rashmi Roshan-Lal.
And I'm Michael Macy.
So, Michael, we've got a slightly depressing subject this time round. Should the United Nations just give up?
Well, it's a touchy subject, with nearly 200 countries gathered for the annual United Nations General Assembly in New York.
Yes, and the UN met with hot wars raging from the Middle East to Europe to Africa. And the UN seemed pretty helpless, even irrelevant. It's been caught up in its high-level week without a clear game plan to stop the escalating violence in Lebanon and the constant violence in Gaza.
That's very true. And the UN turns 80 next year. And a lot of people are beginning to think it's outlived its usefulness.
Well, it's already done a lot better than the League of Nations, the 20th century's first fully developed international political organization dedicated to world peace and security. It's outlasted the League.
Well, the League only lasted 25 years, and then it collapsed when it failed to prevent World War II.
Our reading pile this week actually takes a rather sympathetic view of the United Nations.
Yes, our first book is Five to Rule Them All, the UN Security Council and the Making of the Modern World. It's by David Bosco.
A quite passionate defense of UN privilege.
The author challenges persistent criticisms of the UN, and more specifically of the UN Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, each of whom has a veto on global decisions or actions.
And Bosco says that's just fine. He argues that despite the calls to enlarge and democratize the UN Security Council, its effectiveness depends on remaining small, remaining elite, and remaining relatively opaque.
And he says the focus should be less on how the Security Council interacts with the rest of the world, and more on the fact that its nuclear-armed members haven't gone to war.
A contentious argument.
Well, the second book is contentious too, isn't it?
Right. Her Lover, Belle de Seigneur in the original French by Albert Cohen.
And that's very much of its time, isn't it?
It was originally published in 1968 and only translated into English a few decades later. But the story is set in the old League of Nations, and the mindset it depicts, misogyny, abuse, anti-Semitism, is really considered beyond the pale today.
But it's a love story, isn't it?
A love story, yes, about a Jewish diplomat who works in the League of Nations, and he has this adulterous affair with the wife of a junior diplomat. So it's about the blooming and the withering of their love.
But there are cocktails and dinner parties, and we do come to see the League of Nations as full of lazy, self-interested diplomats.
A contentious view. It's considered a French classic, but fun fact, the author may actually be remembered internationally for something quite different. After World War II, he wrote a 32-page agreement on refugee and travel documents, and it survives today as Article 28 of the Geneva Convention of 1951, which is known as the Refugee Convention.
This week, Those Books really does make you smarter, faster.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week. Bye bye.